Every once in a while, you come across somebody that when they speak, you want to listen because you respect their perspective on things so much. And Derek Woodske is one of those people that I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the last couple years. His background as an athlete, transitioning into a strength coach, and just his take on world events, given the amount of time he has traveled, his time spent in the Middle East, is very unique. We touch on a variety of topics today. We talk about transitioning from that athlete to coach and knowing when it's time. We talk about ego and how it can be used to your benefit and should be used to your benefit at times. We also touch on him being a Canadian, his take on what's going on in Ottawa. And then we dive into why it's so important for kids to be part of a group, whether it's sports or another activity, but to give them a common bond and let them feel like they are part of something bigger than themselves. This episode does go a little bit longer than our normal episode, but it was such a good conversation. I really didn't want to stop. In fact, we probably could have gone another couple hours. I enjoyed the conversation. I think you will too. This is the No Excuse to Miss podcast. Welcome to the No Excuse to Miss podcast. I'm your host, Scott Volkortson. This week, I'm honored to have Derek Woodske on the podcast. For those of you that don't know, Derek has an incredible background. He's a former 3-time junior college national champion and a Canadian national champion record holder in the hammer throw. He was an instructor for Charles Poliquin's group, assistant strength coach for the Cleveland Browns, and then spent 7 years overseas consulting in the Middle East. And Derek's one of those guys that every time I'm around him or talk to him or his name comes up, I feel like I learned something else that he's done that is just cool as hell. So I'm looking forward to this one. Welcome to the show, Derek. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it greatly.
I appreciate you coming on. I'm looking forward to this. I always appreciate your perspective on different things. So before we kind of jump into get started, can you just give a brief background of where you kind of came from and where you're at now?
Yeah. So originally from southeastern British Columbia in a real small logging town. A lot of people that kind of need a geographical focal point is I grew up an hour and a half west of Banff Lake Louise, kind of in that Rocky Mountain Valley, Columbia Valley Basin is what it was called. So extremely rural. My town had one paved road, 95 north and south. It was a logging town. Everything else was dirt. There might have been 130 people, 140 people that lived in the town total. Elementary school was like a K through 7. I think when I graduated elementary school, we had 53 kids in the school, and then we had to get bused into Golden, British Columbia to do our high schooling. So I didn't technically live in Golden, but that's kind of the local town that I get credited with. I lived about 25 miles south down the valley from there. Super rural. I always tell people it was I didn't realize it at the time, but it was one of those communities where by no means were we lawless, but we had no law, right? So we had no police, we had no fire, we didn't have any emergency services of any kind, So every time I ended up taking a trip to the hospital, it was because some logger with like level 3 first aid had to come and grab me and drive me into town, right? Or my dad would come and grab me if he was nearby. So it was one of those interesting little rural, blue collar towns, extremely blue collar, but from there, because my dad had played just enough sports in high school that he'd been quite inquisitive about it. Even though he didn't play sports in college or anything like that, he was always pushing us into activities in terms of, not one of these hockey moms that we had back home or someone like that. It was more like, I'm going to create this opportunity. If you guys do it, that's awesome. We'll do a lot of it. If you don't want to do it, we'll figure something out. So, it was very, very nice that way. Water skied, snow skied, did all those sports because my dad's like, hey, let's go to the lake and see what happens. Right. So that's kind of how my brother and I really dove into sports, because he ended up coming down to the US as well through the junior college system and going to Ashland University where Judd Logan was. And so we had both ended up having a lot of success because of that mindset, considering where we started from. I gravitated towards track and field a lot earlier. And I think some of it was coincidental. The big thing I always tell people, with all the faults that are hitting Canada right now in terms of our government going sideways, the country itself at the base of it where I grew up had some unique things going on. So even though my town was in the middle of nowhere and the high school is very small and we didn't really have sports in the sense of really developed programming, what you ended up getting in those small Canadian towns is highly educated teachers and professors from universities that wanted to semi-retire somewhere beautiful because of the culture, right? So what would end up happening is you get all these teachers from Vancouver, Victoria, typically back then it was BC, now they're all over the nation. They would come out to a town like Golden because they wanted to ski, they wanted to hike, they wanted to mountain climb, they wanted to hunt. I mean, back then it wasn't so unusual for your biology teacher to be a hardcore big game hunter and be open about it. Now it's not so talked about, which is a bummer. But back then, that's how it was. So what would happen is some guy that was, teaching ninth grade biology in Vancouver would be like, oh man, I can get paid the same, provincial salary or whatever teacher salary that was kind of standardized. And I could be in Golden where it's super cheap to live and I get to do all this rad stuff all summer. So what would end up happening is we would get these teachers that would come through that had a little more worldly experience perhaps than say what we were getting typically. And sure enough, I'm in ninth grade and we have a teacher that's like, hey, have you ever heard of the discus? And I'm like, well, kind of, we're not completely under a rock out here. And so he's like, try throwing it. And I'm like, so one day in PE class, I just tried throwing it. Literally, that was it. And stood at home plate in a baseball diamond because we didn't have a track. And I threw a discus out in the field, didn't kill any of my classmates. And he's like, wow, that actually wasn't terrible. You should go to the equivalent of like a state qualifier, right? And I was like, yeah, let's do it. So I went, did okay there. And that was in the ninth grade. And that was just enough of that like spark of potential or the ability to see maybe something over the horizon where I was like, oh, if I do this, I could go to provincials or to the state championship equivalent. And that's all I cared about because I knew that if I went to the championships, I would be now completely separated from all the other athletes in my school because no one else was doing that. No one else had done it. It'd probably been years. I can't even actually guess. 15 years since we'd had someone go to the provincials for track and field, let alone anything. We'd had some people, our teams get close in volleyball and basketball, but nothing, right? So that immediately I was like, this is going to give me something that will set me apart from everybody else. And that's all it took. And then my dad, who, because he had done a little high jump and pole vault and did a little track in high school in the late 60s, was like, oh yeah, that's cool. Yeah, you should totally do that. So he just jumped on board and was like, yeah, this will be fun. And, he was hardcore logger, blue collar dude, but, my dad was a big picture guy, still is. So he was just like, yeah, we'll just build a ring in the backyard. My dad had built our log house by hand. So for him to build a discus ring in our apple field wasn't going to be that challenging. So that's what he did. In our orchard, I had a ring and threw against the backdrop of the Canadian Rockies where our house sat for my high school life. And, I look back on it now and it was kind of a river runs through it about as good as it gets. And that at least got me doing the thing, even though we didn't have coaching or the internet, to a level that was good enough to get a scholarship eventually to a JUCO. I wasn't going to go Division I blue chip out of high school. I just didn't have the development, even though I did okay at the provincials. But getting into the JUCO system in Northern Idaho, that changed everything because that gave me the developmental side from my coaches there, who Bud Rasmussen went on to coach the '08 Olympic team. So I was introduced to these incredible throws coaches. And at that point, everything just exploded because basically I was just like a smoldering fire that needed the right gasoline. And once that happened, it was game over.
Did you have any hesitation leaving Canada to come down to the States?
I had fear. And I always refer to it now as the how I'm stuck on Robin Hood, and it's the wrong analogy. Well, Peter Pan. So it was like Peter Pan syndrome, So I was afraid to leave home because I'd grown up in such a small protected community. I literally grew up knowing every single face and voice on the phone. So like if I picked up a phone, to the point where there was people where I grew up that still had party lines when I graduated high school. We didn't, but I had friends who were on the same phone line as like two other neighbors. And for people that don't have any clue what that means, it literally means if I pick up my telephone at my house, I can hear the conversation of my neighbor 2 miles away because we are sharing the same line. And so you'd be like, hey, Margaret, I need to use the phone. They'd be like, oh, okay, I'll be off in a minute. They hang up, you pick it up and you can use it. Right. And, it was like the small town Kardashians, because what ended up happening is a lot of people, that would be their angst for the day, was listening to their neighbors and getting all the gossip. Right. Our post office was in someone's house, and we knew, because it became an issue, that they would read everyone's mail, right? Like it was just ridiculous. But with that being said, that's how small of a community I grew up in. So the idea, not just leaving that, but then coming to another country. So my brother and I were kind of funny because we had a satellite dish, right? Which by default made us very different than a lot of kids we grew up with, because we didn't have TV channels in our town.
And when you say satellite dish, I'm picturing like the old school 8 or 10 foot one that when it snowed, you couldn't move it, so you couldn't get to the other channels.
That's exactly it, right? Like when reception got bad, you had to go out and sweep your dish because you could tell how much it was snowing outside by how bad the channel quality got. And so we had a satellite dish, and so we started watching American sports, American television. My brother was older than I was, even though he came to the US after me. So he was obsessed with the idea of that already. And so for me, I hadn't really thought about it much. I was so focused on sport itself that I hadn't really thought about like some of the bigger picture stuff. And we didn't have guidance counselors or SATs or any of that stuff to guide us that way. Everybody was telling me, because of how I was focused as a kid, that, oh, you don't parlez-vous français? Well, you're not going to college, right? Like that was the whole mentality in Western Canada. All these teachers are like, oh yeah, you're a write-off. You're just a big, strong kid that's going to work in the lumber yard or drive heavy equipment. And I kind of thought that was probably the case. But a part of my brain wouldn't allow me to fully fall into that psychology. And my dad most certainly didn't allow it. It was his industry. He didn't dislike it, but he's just like, no, you can do whatever you want. And so what ended up happening is, as I came out of high school, my dad actually got transferred within the logging company he was with to a town right on the American border, a town called Creston. And so that also helped a little bit. So I go right out of high school. My parents get transferred to this town right on the Idaho state line. And then all of a sudden, the idea of like dropping south into Coeur d'Alene from where we were was only 100 miles. So that helped too, kind of with the psychology transition, where it's like, well, I go 100 miles south to this little awesome town that has this kick-ass track and field program, or I could go 300 miles to the northeast to Calgary and go to University of Calgary or Mount Royal. And so for me, as crazy as it was, that helped psychologically, because it was everything in my life up to that point had been such specific geography. Like I knew 3 miles to here, 50 miles into the back end to the South Fork. I knew where I could go by foot up into the Rockies where all this animal wildlife was. Like everything for me was that like real old school geography. Like everything was very visual, for lack of a better example. Like when we talked in terms of travel, we described everything. We never talked in miles or time. It'd be like, oh, you're going to get here and you'll go there and it'll look like this. So I think that helped, because once I got down there, man, even for a small JUCO that had a really good track program, I might as well have been playing in the NFL. Like it was so big to me at that time. And what's crazy is I look back on it, we were stealing time out of the local high school and throwing in a parking lot. But I thought that was like, like I still was so far from what, big program like an SEC or an ACC school or even Mountain West when I got there. I mean, that was crazy compared to where I'd come from. I've been thrown on a wood discus ring in a sawdust pile.
And it's crazy to think that your dad had that mindset of you can go do it. Now it's easy to look around because it's, popular on social media to be like, oh, do it, follow your passion, do all this. But 20, 25 years ago, that wasn't the case. And I'm assuming even more so in small town US or Canada. You went into, the local business and you just worked your 9 to 5 and that's what you did.
It was such a small town that most people didn't pay for their groceries at our local grocery store until the end of every month. Right? Like that's still how things were. And so, everyone ran a tab, everyone had a bill. It was funny. And I'm not 100% sure why maybe because my dad, even to this day, has always been extremely well read. In his line of work, it was a big math and things that I wasn't good at, I suppose, math and physics and et cetera. And even though he was in management, he was always involved in things that were kind of outside the scope of the town, and maybe that's what helped. Maybe the fact that he always was thinking in terms of, well, we got to cut down these trees in this little town and put them on this rail car, but I'm responsible for where this lumber ends up in Libby, Montana, or wherever, Oregon. So, I think that probably changed it a lot. In terms of his mind, because he was already dealing with things that were a little more global. So for him, it was no big deal. The idea of me going to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho made sense to him because, his logs go to Libby, right? Like, so to head down south was like, yeah, the world's a pretty big place. There's opportunity everywhere. And then once I got to the US and I got into the system, it was amazing. Like I look at that chunk of time, and now that I'm older, I'm like, well, I lived here for as long as I lived there, time wise. I always catch myself doing that. Be like, I lived for 2 years in Mammoth Lakes, California. Well, I was only in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho for 2 years for JUCO, but that 2 years, so much more came out of it in terms of opportunity and direction in life and where it took me down the road, and who it introduced me to and how it set up. And it's kind of funny when I think of those younger year instrumental moments, like how much more impactful 20 months in one place can be than 30 months in another, and it's, and I'm always cognizant of that. It's like, you can end up somewhere and have a huge amount come out of it in a very short period of time. Or when I was in Cleveland, maybe the third round of Cleveland, I remember having an address there for 6 months that has no correlation to anything. Like it was just an address, so it's kind of funny how those things can work in that regard, if you're looking for opportunity.
Well, I think that's key. You have to be looking, you can either go through the motions or you can, invest yourself into that area and see what comes of it. So as you went through your athletic career, I'm always interested when people have success in sports, how do they know when it's time to transition to that next phase? And how hard is that to, for lack of a better term, come to grips with the fact that the next phase is where you have to go?
Yeah. So mine was kind of interesting. So I competed through college, got injured really badly in college. So I thought I was done anyway. I had a prepatellar ligament rupture on the right leg. It's the same one John Wellborn had as well. And he and I are actually the only two people that we know that have had that particular injury. We've known people that have had variations of, but we had very unique, horrific ruptures. Oddly enough, though, we both came back from ours. But I thought that was it. So when that happened, came out of college, finished up in 2001 in Wyoming, and took a job straight away. Took a coaching job, NCAAs at Eastern Michigan University in Ypsilanti. And so I just kind of packed up my Honda Civic and drove east out to Michigan and started coaching. And at that point, I had no ideas about continuing to throw or continuing to train. I was, I kind of wanted to, but my body was so beat up from that injury. Like I barely made it through my senior year, and I'd missed my junior year completely. And so when I got out there, now I'm kind of on my own, like I'm coaching at this big school relatively, but I have no support system. I don't have athletic training staff anymore. I don't have any of those things. Like I'm just kind of like everyone else, right? Like you don't have all these magical people that can come and do things for you when you need treatment or health issues. So, it was kind of like being thrown to the wolves and having to grow up. It was scary, because I'm moving further east and all this and getting further from that little valley that I grew up in. But that year really kind of jarred me into becoming self-sufficient. So, I started coached my athletes, did all that part of it. It was something I enjoyed to do right from the beginning. But I had to kind of look at, how do I do this myself? How do I keep going if I want to keep going? How do I train properly? Like, how do I avoid the mistakes that, my coach had not been able to avoid at Wyoming? And so as I began that process, it was amazing how, I continued to heal and get healthier, but it started to make me become very aware of a lot of other sources of information, a lot of other interesting people. And right at about that same time, my brother ended up at Ashland University where Judd Logan was coaching. And so Judd and I started spending time together. I would drive the 2 hours down to Ashland. I'd watch practice. He didn't know what my goals were at that time. And I was just kind of another coach. So he saw me as a coach from Eastern. He was a coach at Ashland. He was coaching my brother. And so I would ask a ton of questions. He would give a ton of answers. And then that put me on a road to just finding information, which I then was able to take and turn back on myself and start healing my injury quicker. I started using sources on the internet that was a game changer. Started being able to learn strength and conditioning theory and practice in a way that I'd never been exposed to from people I would have never been exposed to. And over the course of that year, I actually started to train again and train myself. And things went well enough in that year at Eastern Michigan that Judd opened up an assistant coaching job at Ashland for me. And what we think now in terms of like volunteer assistant, but it was a little more gray than that back then. So I moved out to Ashland, left Eastern Michigan, and I said, okay, if I'm going to make this my last shot, I'm going to train from basically the fall of 2002 until I get through an Olympic cycle. I thought, 04, I'll give it 2 more years. In that 2 years, I developed quite a bit and everything went really well. Retrospect, I was injured in 2000. It kind of goes back to what I said about how much can happen in 2 years that you kind of lose track. So I was injured in 2000, completely out for that whole year. And when I just missed the team in 04, I kind of thought, oh man, how could I just miss that team? Well, it was like three years, like from not being able to walk to just missing a team in 3 years, right? And so when I look back on it, that time seems like such a bigger chunk, but it really wasn't. So, I definitely have come to terms with that. So in 04, just missed the team. 05, break the Canadian national record, had a great season. But at that point, I knew that training through to 2008 was not something psychologically I wanted to do. Okay. For me, I realized that going another 4 years it just didn't feel right. So I competed through 05, 06. I kind of like followed up on some like commitments I had to do. So I had to compete at one more Canadian national championships. And I went to the Commonwealth Games in Melbourne. But then at 30, I was done. In retrospect, I was a very young 30, physically even with all those injuries. So if I could tell my previous self one thing, is I was more than capable in 06 to train through to 08. Like my body was just really starting to heal from that injury. to be 100% honest. I think in 06, 07, 08, I would have been really better off to have kept training on a peasant's wage than to go and get a job in the coaching industry again, even though I ended up in the NFL in 07 as an assistant coach. I think from a fulfillment standpoint, I should have trained through 08 and just kept doing what I was doing. I would have been 32. I would have started my life after that anyway, because I didn't start working for Poliquin until 2010 anyway. And I'll be 100% honest, between 08 and 10, that was a rough couple of years. Like I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't have sport, but I didn't really have a career. I kind of went back to school, and I would have been better off just to stay in the system and then do what my brother did and just make a hard, abrupt turn to career. And a buddy of mine, Jim Stacey, up in Canada, who eventually broke my Canadian record, went on to do a couple Canadian Olympic teams. He's another example of that. Sport, boom, left for the police academy. Like just like hang up that. Yep, exactly. And just make the switch, make it abrupt, make it aggressive, and put that same focus and energy into something else you really want to do. Like if I could give advice to kids coming through the systems now that, were like me, maybe guys that weren't good enough to have these big Nike endorsements where it buys them some space, because that's really what it is, buying space, right? Buying time to figure out what you want to do. But if it's like Laurie Smith, Colorado State University, Olympian in the hammer, finishes up, goes to med school, like abrupt. Now she's a doctor. Like, don't wait on that transition. And I think in track and field in particular, way too many athletes wait to figure out what they want to do. And I've seen those kids, I did it for 2 years. I've seen people do it for 10, right? Where you're just like, you haven't transitioned from sports. And they're just like kind of floating. And you're like, Jesus Christ, I don't know what's going to happen to this guy or girl. They should be doing something with what I know their abilities to be at this point. And so there's I think in retrospect, I would have just adjusted that a bit. It would have been a hard exit for me, like a hard, crisp one if I did it twice.
I think I just saw it on social media the other day. Ryan Lochte, the former swimmer, has been going through some stuff trying to figure out, and he's become very open and honest on his post about the struggles he's gone through since he quit swimming, and he's like the second most decorated swimmer behind Phelps. And, he's struggling with, okay, what's that next thing? What's that next step? And I think I don't know how old he is, maybe 37 or something I read. Right. But it's interesting that, you see that so often, I think, in sports where people hang on or they don't know what's next.
They don't know what's next. The familiarity of that routine is so comforting, and everyone's like, oh man, I can't wait until I'm done. This is so hard. You look at track athletes, right? It's like you got some marathoner who their speed day, one of the marathoners I coached, Emily Mortensen, a speed day for them under their specific field event or a track coach was like 10 repeat 400s, and it's like, how, psychologically you're like, that's an easy day for you, like that is horrific amount of training volume and just grindability by these people. And, when you pull that plug out, the fact that became so consistent that it became comfortable to the point where they're like, I got repeat 400s on Wednesday. Awesome. So when that becomes your standard of comfort, it is extremely psychologically difficult when they transition away from all of that. The emotional, chemical stress, when that's gone, and by no means does a marathoner, even though I think they should probably have PTS, but it's, but by no means do they. But what they do get is it's also like, it becomes like a hypnotic existence, right? It's so consistent, so programmed, so repeatable, and so familiar that when you take away, more importantly, that amount of time that athletes have spent during a day, very focused and very clear of thought, and then you're like, hey, I'm going to give you 6 hours a day back where you're now 100% responsible for that time. But more importantly, you now, for the first time in years, are going to be cognizant of your thoughts and fears on a real level. And I think that's, that documentary that came out, I think it was Netflix, and it was talking about suicides in sports and suicide attempts and post-athletic existence. I, from my personal belief, I think that's where some of that manifests. It's not just the loss of purpose or a loss of identity. There's a lot of time where the same driving thought processes that make someone a good athlete, perhaps, are what we think of as a high achiever, that, a lot of that thought process isn't always positive, so that thought process that's occurring every day is this like repetitive hamster wheel of you're not good enough, you can't achieve, you got to do more, you got to do this, you have to overcome, and it's constant. It's like this drum that never stops beating. Now, what happens, I think, with some of these athletes is when you take away the mechanism or what I would call the medication to treat that mechanism, which is going into the pool or going onto the ski hill or going into the weight room and having that success moment where you're like, whew, okay, that drum is beating, right? That perpetual drum of not being good enough. But I just went into the gym and my metrics and my standards tell me I'm on gold medal pace and everything's good and my teammates agree. That drum silences, right? Until it beats again in the next morning. That drum starts to beat again and beat again and beat again. And so I think what happens is all of a sudden you take away that 6-hour medication that you have every day for that drum. And they're like, that drum keeps beating. But now they don't have direction. Maybe they didn't have enough success to have huge financial windfall. So they didn't transition that into something where it makes them feel socially successful, right? They have a gold medal, but they live in a 1-bedroom apartment and they can barely feed themselves. So when you have somebody that has a gold medal psychology in a losing lifestyle, I think that the intervention to help those people, if it's not recognized, is catastrophic. And we're seeing it now where people are becoming more open about it. People that are talking about suicide in sport, suicide in our first responders, suicide in obviously our military personnel coming home, when they take away that mechanism of belonging, achievement, success, that voice is very loud. At least now we're having conversations about it, because 5 years ago, even the best athletes in the world didn't kill themselves. That's crazy. That's literally what people said. That's why would they do that? They're superstar. Look at him. Look at her. Well, because that's not how the brain and psychology actually works in high achievers, and it's a tough conversation to have, but it's become a little easier, thankfully.
And like with those high achievers, do they have to go to a different mental place? Because obviously everybody that gets to that level is physically gifted.
Right.
Do the high achievers, like the ones that are making the Olympic teams and, breaking records like you did, is that what separates them? Is their thought process and mindset that allows them to do that day in and day out? Could that also be like what hurts them post sports?
I think so. I think to some degree that is the case. You'll meet some people that seem really, well established in their mindset and ability to work back into society. But I always take athletes, in particular athletes that have come from individual-based sports, not so much team-based sports. I see less of an issue with team-based. And I don't know if maybe because the burden of weight wasn't so like clearly set upon one person, with the individual psychology of an individual sport there. And I don't care what anyone says, there is a part of us that want to be in that individual sport because you win alone. Like everyone always used to say, I wasn't good with team sports, because when the team lost or the team wasn't focused. I don't want that running back to be like mailing it in when I'm on like defense. Like you hear all those cliches of people trying to pass the energy. And it's like, let's get to the root of it. You want to win and you want to win, period. You individually, you want to be the gold medalist. You want to be the MVP of the Super Bowl. That's what you want to be. And that's, I think, is an underlying driving factor for individual sports success. It's yes, you want to have sole accountability so you don't have to rely on somebody that's mailing it in. I get that. There is a truth to that. But that also means that you also want to carry the weight of the championship on your ego, right? And there is not an athlete or a high achiever or somebody that is pushing for a gold medal in anything that doesn't have ego involvement. We have this, modern culture, and everyone talks about the current woke culture of America. To me, the woke bullshit started 10 years ago when everyone started talking about how the ego has no place, right? And it's like, and these are people that are like, live in the now and, dissolve your ego and be, oneness with the universe of perpetual existence, right? And it's like, and you just want to be like, you need the ego. The ego's not a bad thing. An unchecked ego has a tendency to get you in trouble because you will start to make mistakes. But if you have a balanced ego, along with the ability to be self-aware and know that you have to exist within the societal framework to be successful, and you don't want to be a scumbag and you don't want to ostracize, and you're not a sociopath, so your narcissistic tendencies aren't the driving factor of your existence. Ego's okay, right? Ego is going to be the thing that makes you let's be honest, accountable to self, right? Because you don't want to tarnish that which is you by failing to put in the work every day. Now, the problem with that is the ego will get in the way when it's time to make that transition. And that transition is, holy crap, okay, so I'm not going to be the sole proprietor of everything successful. I got to ask for help. This is crazy, right? And it's such a simple transition if people can wrap their head around it. A coach is that help. Training staff is that help. It's just you've compiled them into your perfect little world and they're yours, right? So you cradle them like this infant that comes with you that, it's I'm the champion, they're my support staff. You got to break that psychology, right? Because at the end of the day, your coach looks at you the exact same way as your egotistical mind looks at them. Right? Their success is your physical manifestation of ability, right? So, a coach that has a gold medal athlete is producing these athletes that are doing it for them, right? So the coach is a gold medal coach. So you got to get rid of all that framework and just have an honest conversation about it and be like, oh, okay, I got to go back and start asking for help again. I need new mentors. I need new people that I can put my faith in to teach me, and their desire to teach me is going to fulfill them because that's where they get their purpose from. And you go through all these different realizations and steps, and you create these new healthy relationships and healthy growth cycles. Where I find people get into trouble is when they self-isolate in the transition and they live in the ego in that perspective. And that is where I fear for a lot of single athlete identities or non-team based identities. Not that this would happen, but take someone like Michaela Schiffer on this past Olympics. If for some reason she could not be back on skis again next season, the weight of how this past year has gone for her, there has to be some intervention there. She will need someone to work with her to get through what just happened at the Olympics, as an example. That, to me, when I look at an athlete, if someone was like, hey, give me one red flag athlete that I would be like, someone needs to keep an eye on, she's the one. It just matches up with all the metrics that we deal with in that transition phase.
And I think, like you said, it becomes their identity of who they are.
Mm-hmm. And so does the winning, which is really terrible because winning's not guaranteed.
That's a great point. And I think we see it with Olympic athletes, pro athletes.
Yeah.
That's why it'll be interesting to see like what happens to a guy like Tom Brady, that there's already rumors that he doesn't know if he's going to be able to stay retired.
Brett Favre, right?
came back,
It's yeah.
Well, back a couple decades, Jordan came back after what he could have retired, going out with 3 titles or, 6. But then he came back and.
Yep. He came back, kept playing, it's Jordan's an interesting one to me. There is no mystery to me that he's a billionaire, right? Like that site. Now, granted, he had a huge amount of celebrity that allowed him to pioneer it into something like the Air Jordan with a lot of help. But with that being said, it's still like what, the number 1 selling basketball shoe in the world, And when you start to look at that doesn't, there's a lot of great players whose gear or merch never did that. Now, is he the anomaly? Like, there's always going to be that one great iconic figure in a thing. Yeah, maybe. But I just get the feeling the guy's in the background just kicking in doors every day. Yeah. Like that's who he is. That's how it's going to be. And he wants his shoe, his persona, his existence to still be number 1. And I think it's going to be that way for a while. I do think that others are going to struggle to make that transition. Doesn't mean they're going to struggle in life. These guys could be happy as pigs in mud, but does Tom Brady move into something else that gives him the same sense of achievement that his career in the NFL has? I don't know. It's not going to be financial. Yeah. When you look at Peyton Manning, for example, he's done it very cleverly. He exited stage left as a champion and just casually moved right into media, right? And I think he's probably done it about as clean as anyone I've seen in a long time.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and go into.
Yeah.
I'm always fascinated by Charles Poliquin.
Yeah.
Partly because he's like such a polarizing figure. And he did a lot of what he did, without social media.
Yeah.
So
a
lot. And he built up if you're into the nutrition fitness world whatsoever, you may agree or disagree with him, but more than likely, who he is. I mean,
correct.
So without getting into like the polarizing part, what are some of the things that you learned from him? Like the way he built his business with all the, quote unquote haters out there constantly trying to discredit him.
Yeah. Well, and that's a big part of it. Like the amount of hate that he received so the amount of animosity the industry felt towards Charles was only balanced out by the amount of literal diehard followers, right? And, I remember, and before I get into the nuts and bolts of it, as an example, his company, before he kind of had the separation from it, before his death, there was a bit of the company kind of got broken apart. And that was like a business issue he was having with his ex-wife, who was like 51% owner of his company, right? So like his company didn't fracture because it wasn't making money. It fractured because he and his ex-wife owned it, right? So you have to keep that in perspective because he never stopped being successful. I remember we had 1 month where we were kind of just looking at numbers. We didn't manufacture any supplements. We were a third-party relabeler, and they still are to this day, of supplements. So we use Designs for Health or, some of these like medical grade companies based in the US that, could pass all the stringent testing, but they private labeled what we needed. So what Charles had figured out is what we now typically hear the term as protocols, right? He'd figured out, well, if we use this protocol or supplement formulation, which has kind of become the industry standard for a lot of medical grade supplements, if you take these things, it'll have roughly this effect at improving these conditions, right? So that's what Charles was really into. And I remember we had 1 month where our sales, and I'll talk about how we set up the sales system, but our sales were just in fish oil was $1 million for 1 month. of fish oil pills. And that was one of many things we sold. And that was as a third party repackager. So Designs for Health made their cut before we made our cut, right? And I think that's who was doing our fish oils at the time. Might have been Metagenics, doesn't matter. But, that would have been probably around 2012, to 2013. So Charles was very clever. He had been a very successful coach. He himself realized very early on that there was a marketing side to success. Now, he loved bodybuilding, so he was always going to kind of look like a bodybuilder by personal perspective. Like, he liked to lift that way. He wasn't the strongest guy in the gym by any stretch of the imagination. He wasn't one of these guys where, had been like a power lifter or Dave Tate type guy or Jim Wendler, where they were very specific. They had been athletes in a sport that transitioned it into business. He was a guy that was a gym rat bodybuilder and a bookworm, right? That had been Charles. So he was highly intellectual, like, spectrum level intellect, spoke multiple languages. Obviously, French was his origin language coming from Canada, but he was always seeking to get into the coaching world. And he got very fortunate. He started coaching for Canadian athletes, and back then, wasn't even email. Like, you were literally mailing workouts to people, and they would do workouts. And then he started writing in journals and getting into the early days, the strength stuff in terms of getting published. So he went through all those systems. We forget because it was in the 80s, right, that he was getting published in collegiate journals and getting published going through his master's thesis and all that good stuff, like old school, theory and understanding of something, right? Like, you go to university and then you have to write a paper that gets approved and published in a journal. So he went through that whole system. And as he came up through that system, he met more and more Olympic athletes. And now the area that it gets a little gray, and it probably should be clarified, is, Charles gets credited with coaching hundreds of Olympic athletes. Well, so how that actually works is, if you're, say, named in Canada, which, we know is a massive country, if you're named head men's and women's Olympic sports strength coach for Team Canada, right, which probably back then, well, I know for a fact, back then was unpaid, right? So say he's based in Calgary, and if he's in the weight room in Calgary working with bobsleigh and luge and some speed skate, now those are his athletes. Those are the ones he's overseeing because he's at the Olympic Training Center in Calgary. If there's a freestyle athlete out in Quebec, right, skiing under their own coach doing their own thing, which is really kind of normal, and that athlete wins a gold medal for Team Canada at the Olympics in '88, he's still going to get credit because he's the strength and conditioning coach for Team Canada Olympic sports, right? Did they develop the programming for the athlete? Maybe, probably not. The athlete probably wasn't even lifting weights, right? So there's a little bit of that, that people got really upset with him over the years, because he would get credited for so-and-so's Olympic medal, and then that person's strength coach would hate Charles forever, right? Right? But it's the politics of the whole deal, right? It's like that everywhere. So when Charles kind of came through, he used that to segue into writing for different magazines, doing editorials, pre-internet. And that caused him to explode into basically what we think of as like just the commercial market, right? Because he was so successful and he was able to speak in terms of strength and conditioning and relate it to athletics that made sense. He had an amazing way of taking complex concepts and becoming a very clean medium for him by like breaking away all the nonsense. And he had good people around him that understood and he could relate to. It's one thing to be a good mentor, but a good mentor without the proteges that can actually put into practice the things you're trying to mentor everyone on is kind of useless, right? So he had these Olympic athletes that really gravitated towards him, like Andre Benoit, who's a strength coach to this day. These guys were Olympians under him that could also translate what he was trying to say in terms of the transition of coach to athlete to general public. But at the same time, the guy was jacked, right? So he looked like a pro bodybuilder. So that entered him into the media realm because he looked a certain way. So he had all this knowledge and ability, a certain look and presentability, and that was great for magazines. So he got into like Muscle Media 2000 and writing in all these all mags in the early 2000s, and that got him into the US. And when he got into the US, he just coincidentally was based in Colorado Springs. And in the same building that he was magically based, because the universe is like this, was Testosterone Nation. T-Mag by TC Loma was being published out of that same building as the internet was exploding. So now they got this guy, Charles Poliquin, who's kind of like 2 doors down. And who else was in that building? Dr. Leahy, who created active release technique, right? Or ART. So there was all these magical things that probably should be its own documentary were occurring at the same time, right? And I can't remember T-Mag's original supplement. It'll come to me, but they had their own supplement brand. I can picture the box, but I can't remember the name right now. BioTest, maybe, or something like this. So they were creating supplements. So they realized, well, we get all these people on a social media platform and start putting out all this free content, which has now become the public, the community standard. We're going to get all these great coaches to just dump free content, but every article is going to have an advertisement for our supplement company. Or every time we reference supplements, we'll reference like Plasma Grow 10,000 for their hypertrophy, and they'll just put it right in the text, and they'll reference it as, hey, pre-workout, I took my plasma, blah, blah, blah. And then the article's a Charles Poliquin article or a whoever article. And so that's how Charles really transitioned from like what I would think is print media into the internet existence, right? And that allowed him to start making money, had a huge name, pulling in now pro athletes from baseball, football, et cetera. The one-offs, right? No longer focusing on team stuff like the Olympic team, even though he's still working with Olympic athletes. But once you get that media presence and that like almost underground, hey, I went and trained with this guy in Colorado Springs for 6 weeks type of stuff, that's big money starts coming in because these guys start paying top dollar for that. And that's how it goes. And that allowed him to open up his first training center, which was down in Arizona. And now you could go and find the Oracle Charles Poliquin if you had enough money in your pocket. And it became, that's the guy you go speak to. He's doing things different. It's not all sit back away from your knees, square 90-degree box squat. None of that. He didn't come from that world. He came from an Olympic lifting based design systems, athletic base under Pierre Roy. He came from all of that real strength and conditioning background in Quebec and Ottawa in particular, city-wise. And so he has all that like understanding. Now, the knees over toes guys, that's they reference specifically Charles. That's where all that comes from. Charles didn't invent it, but he was so steadfast in believing that that's the way that you train, he'd never relinquished it. Like he never broke to the pressure of the West Side system, even though we went and trained under or went and studied under Louis to see what they were doing. He just never broke. So he kept growing that. And that is where, as the internet came out, and he makes that transition into the Poliquin Performance Center that started in Arizona. That's where you start to see him branching off and starting to create an entire belief system to the left that was counterintuitive or opposite of the Epleys of Nebraska or the sit away from box squat mentality of big time football, right? And with that being said, he started to isolate his own system at that time in the early 2000s. But in doing so, he was also able to use that system to heal and recover a lot of athletes. And so they would go and get blown up at some program, come to him. He would knees over toes guys, like ATG them back into being healthy, get their knees good, everything good. ART, right? He was one of the first instructors ever for active release technique because Leahy was in the office he was in. So he learned it he drank from the hose, right from day one. So he was doing all these like voodoo things in his offices and creating this massive following, which he had then figured out with Andre Benoit, Owen Lacey over in Ireland, and John Connor, who coached Conor McGregor. they figured out how to take Poliquin's words and belief systems and really kind of shape them into an education platform, which became the Poliquin PICP stuff. And then Charles was so obsessed with the bodybuilding, because you got to remember, he never let go of that. Like the cosmetic, body composition stuff was still what he loved. So he started to create a branch off, which was the biosignature system, was how do I use nootropic supplementation and diet to manipulate, and this is where it'll deviate, get a little funny, but how do I create body composition changes without any exercise outside of weightlifting, right? Because that was the other thing that people hated about him, and is one of the areas I even disagreed with Charles was, listen, you got to do some cardio, right? Like you got to exercise, you got to take care of you got to do that. And his whole mentality was, and where it comes from is, I'll say it from two standpoints. One, he wasn't any good at it, so he didn't like doing it, right? He didn't like to run. He didn't like to be on a stair stepper. I can relate. He hated it, right? So that was part of it. The other part of it was, he was like, I'm a strength coach. If I got an athlete for 6 weeks, the only thing I need to focus on is healing injuries, preventing injuries, and getting them so strong that then when they get back out to practice, that strength we developed, our hypertrophy strength, will carry through for a long period of time. And he also knew that if you have a linebacker and you put an inch on their arms, and he knew this, not only will everyone on their team notice, so next year you'll have 4 guys, the year after you'll have 16 guys, the year after you'll have the whole team coming to you in the off season, but there is a psychological trigger to that 21-year-old guy when everybody's like, whoa, you look jacked. What'd you do? I trained with this guy in the off season. That guy steps on the field with a slightly different demeanor than he had the year before. And Charles knew that, right? And so it's like people used to just blow him up. Wow, so-and-so doesn't need to train arms to be a defensive tackle. And it's like, yeah, does he though? There's a strong argument to be said that, there might be a mild improvement in performance if he does, but there's going to be a massive improvement in how that person is recognized on the field. So that's why all his athletes were so jacked, regardless of the sport.
Well, I remember I actually met him in Colorado at a marketing conference. Right. And this was just a couple years prior to his death. And I always admired him, like, for all the success that he had. He would have been probably in his mid-50s then. Is that right? And, he was still trying to learn, how can he capitalize on YouTube? How can he use Facebook to help him? He wasn't sending people that work for him. He was sitting at that conference just like the rest of us, wanting to learn, these new technologies to him and how he could best utilize them to grow his business and promote his message.
What's really funny about that, the way that you describe that, and this is important, and I wish more people would understand this. Like, okay, so this is going to sound morbid on from one side of it, but I think you'll see what I'm saying. Charles has since left. We're having a conversation about Charles. There's a shitload of fitness influencers who, if they die today, we will not know who they were tomorrow. A shitload, right? And they're famous today. They are, you go on social media and you're going to see something, be like, holy crap, they got 40,000 views. They got money in the bank right now. They have all these things, right? They look a certain way. Charles, and I remember this clearly. I remember Charles paying every weekend he was on a plane, $10,000, $20,000 first class tickets, $1 million in a bank account, right? I sound like Ric Flair right now, but he's got alligator boots and Rolexes, right? And had 50,000. His company had 50,000 followers. Right. And he was like, holy crap, we're at 50,000, like blown away by that metric, getting like 300 likes on a Facebook post back then. Right. Because Instagram was still kind of coming around. But he was like, his head couldn't wrap around one of his students coming through the system that had like 12 or 14,000 followers already. He's like, I don't get it. He's like, what are they doing different? And it was something that he was always trying to figure out, because he knew that his 50,000 followers created this business equaled this quality of lifestyle and financial success. And he's like, man, what if I got to 1 million? Like, I remember him thinking that. He saw the metric rise of what could happen. Now, unfortunately, I don't think any of us saw how manipulated that world was going to become with the algorithms and all the stuff that's since followed. But if it had stayed clean and true, if Charles Poliquin didn't have 1 million followers, if he was still with us today, if he didn't have 1 million followers today, right? Like, how would that be possible? But that was kind of the path he was going on. I don't think he would have been 1 million follower, influential superstar. But he owned 3 houses, a business, and never worried about a dime in his life. So, right? Like, I still make the strong argument that your legacy, in particular, your ability in our human performance industry, and he kind of knew this from day one, it still goes back and hangs on whether or not you produced athletes or produced success. You know, like the influencers, I hope they're making so much money it doesn't matter when the candle burns out. But that is not a sustainable system for long-term success.
No, at some point you have to, whether it's a physical product or a service, you have to produce results in order to stay in it, stay memorable, stay important to the progression of the industry. You know, because I mean, we always talk about this, right? Are you a consumer of society? Are you a creator for society? You know, are you giving? Are you taking? This is a constant conversation people are having about self-worth and and their existence. And it's like, yeah, Charles probably consumed a lot in his life. He had the means to consume. But the fact that a company like Knees Over Toes is probably making a crap load of money right now by repackaging the information they learned from him in a way that is actually not just being sold, but people are using with some level of success and healing people. I mean, that's lineage, right? Charles is dead and he's still making people rich. Like, you know what kind of impact you have? And helping people get healthy even more so than getting them rich. People are, improving their health because of it.
Improving their health, their mobility, their wellness. I read an article recently that was talking about this like big breakthrough with this supplement and how it was lowering cholesterol and reactive proteins and inflammation of the heart. This was all stuff that Charles would talk about to death in the early 2000s. This was just stuff that to him was old news. I remember when On It Nutrition and Aubrey Marcus's book came out, and it was talking about, I was listening to it on audio when I was in the Middle East, making my drive back and forth through the desert. And I was like, oh, this is really good information. I was listening and I was like, oh yeah, this is excellent. And I'm like, oh yeah. This is like circa 1997, right? This is T-Meg, Charles Poliquin forgotten files that are now someone's like claim to health and wellness, right? And he doesn't probably even realize that Charles was talking about this stuff in the late 90s, early 2000s. He's just discovering it, utilizing it, changing his life. But where it came from, I mean, it's a torn map and a lost compass from where that guy's at,
So along those lines, like whether you learned it from Charles or just learned it along the way, what are some things like, people listening that maybe aren't pro athletes or they're not going to be pro athletes or they're not even competing in a sport, but what are like some of the supplementation things that you found that everybody should be doing?
Right.
And I know you can't say broadly everybody, but as a generality, like that could be a good idea to check into. Maybe put it that way.
I think so. Charles had ones that he never went without. So for people that knew Charles, this will be no surprise. Everyone always assumes it's going to be something fancy, but for Charles, the base supplement that you had to take every single day was magnesium. Magnesium was numero uno for Charles. If you didn't take magnesium, you were missing out on the effectiveness of almost everything that followed after that, from cognition to muscle contraction to sleep, right? That was always the big one, which we know magnesium's tied to. Followed that up by zinc. Almost everyone that Charles dealt with through inadequate diets, even if they followed his systems completely, meat and nut breakfast, the whole 9 yards, zinc, right? So now we got two base minerals. We got magnesium, we got zinc. Now you can get into depth. The one thing I will tell you is he would always say, stay away from salts, right? So you want to use chelated variations of those, right? So like, he wasn't a big fan of magnesium oxide, magnesium citrate, right? Which is a laxative anyways. Why people live on that, it blows my mind. So he, so he'd be more like magnesium biglycinates, right? Tetrates, zinc picolinate, right? That was his. So you get through those. Then after that, it was methylation of B vitamins. That's going to be the number 3. And people are like, well, what does that mean? Well, if you eat asparagus and you go and use the bathroom and it smells, you have an issue. Like that's a genetic disorder. I got it. The inability to metabolize folates it's a very common thing, especially Northern Europeans. So if you pee and you smell that asparagus smell, it means that you don't metabolize folates and methylate. And unless your B vitamin, in particular B12, is methylated, you're not going to absorb it very well at all, if at all, right? So simple stuff like that. So you know that, okay, I'm going to have to chalk up a couple more bucks and buy a methylated B12 instead of just, standard B vitamins. So now you got those 3. Those are going to be the essentials. Post-workout, vitamin C to deal with inflammation and hormonal response. And then a very good, like Thorne Nutritions or companies of that level of production, multivitamin. Very good multivitamin. And then, of course, not to the doses that he recommended to make money back in the day, but fish oil, right? And those are going to be your big ones. If you do that every single day and you're consistent and high quality formulations, you're so far ahead of where everybody else is, right? Now, he would kind of push you towards using like a methylated B vitamin complete. So not just the B12, but everything that comes with it. And then after that, he used to go deep down the rabbit holes, which now, 20 years later, even myself with experience, I don't think are as important. I've been able to work with obviously more people than just Charles now in terms of the sports nutrition and supplementation side of it. And it's more important to me now is you find your base nutrients that you're delinquent in or you have deficiencies. And it's better to take more of a few things than a whole bunch of stuff, right? And that's where I think a lot of people are kind of missing the boat. Charles was a huge nootropic guy, but it was specific nootropics, right? This like taking a little dash of this and a little dash of that and sticking it into your proprietary blend. So you have huperzine, that's going to be an anti-inflammatory cognition supplement in there, but you also got, a shotgun approach of other stuff. Maybe you should just go back and be specific into acetylcholine, be specific into controlling inflammation of the brain and using fish oil as a nootropic, right? Like taking that avenue and going down that road as far as possible instead of just being like, okay, this proprietary blend should knock out all these issues. Well, maybe, or maybe you just need phosphatidylserine, right? Like being much more specific about what you're doing with the nootropic. You might be better off taking, you do the Braverman's test and you realize that you're really high dopamine, acetylcholine in terms of your brain function. And maybe you're someone that needs lots of GABA to offset your natural brain chemistry at night. So you're not going to go just take some random sleep formulas that have a bunch of stuff. You're going to go to Thorne and you're going to buy GABA and you're going to take it before you go to bed, right? Like you get really specific. You're going to take your GABA, you're going to take your magnesium, boom, right? Or like this really cool supplement I've been playing with this week from a company called Protect. It has like theanine, magnesium biglycinate, I believe, and valerian root. Like, I can remember that. And I think I might have got the magnesium wrong, oddly enough, but I can remember that. I'm looking at it. There's 3 ingredients, all of which, it's got GABA. It's got GABA, all of which increase the brain's ability to settle in. That's what I'm looking for now. And that's where I think you would have saw Charles moving people towards over time, is get away from shotgun approaches and be more specific with what you need, even if it means taking a higher dose. Like Charles always talked about magnesium. People are taking 400 milligrams. Charles is like, over the course of a day, maybe you need 3 grams, right? And that's, you got to be careful. Get a little gray when you start talking about supplement dosing, right? But that's how his mindset was. If you have this horrific issue with inflammation, maybe 2 grams of fish oil isn't enough. Maybe you take 6 grams of fish oil a day for a period of time until you deal with that specific inflammation issue, or that issue with cognition starts to improve. Or, maybe if you start taking acetylcholine or phosphatidylserine, all of a sudden short-term memory, or maybe high-level memory function improves. Well, maybe that's what you need then for an extended period of time to work on those markers that you can actually measure. I don't think biosignature measures as much as it was claimed to measure in terms of supplements effectiveness, but I do think there are executive function things that we can test now with nootropics, where if you manipulate them, they will improve name recognition and remembrance, things of that nature. You figure out what makes that better, and then just take higher doses of fewer things.
Well, and we have so much testing, affordable testing that we can do now, just as an average person that's not part of a pro sports team. And the other thing that I try to do is I'll keep a journal when I start a new routine or supplement. And just, and I realize there's measurables and all that stuff, but I'll just write down, did I think my cognition was better? Did I feel better? Was my energy better?
Right. Did I take a supplement and then have an unexpected bout of like recognizable depression? Like that happens, especially with nootropics, all the time. And it can be inversely related, right? So someone goes and takes a bunch of stimulants, and then they feel like they're going to cry their eyes out and have a depressive moment in the weight room. And you're like, what's going on? They're like, I don't know. I feel horrible. And you're like, oh, okay. So we need to ramp you back. Like caffeine will do that to people, right? People that over caffeinate themselves get this inverse relationship, and they show up to practice yawning and kind of like melancholy. And you're like, well, caffeine isn't you shouldn't be consuming caffeine as your go-to pre-workout. Your brain doesn't need that, right? So when you're talking about using that journal, that is key essential. Like Judd Logan, who's recently passed away, what Judd was a master at was documenting his success and failures, but his successes. He had every training journal from before the 1984 Olympics.
Wow.
And that was a guy that competed through to the 2000 Olympics. And you'd be like, hey, what were you'd be like, hey, Judd, do you remember what you were doing during the 92 Olympics? And he'd be like, oh yeah. And he would get excited. He would go find his journals from that year. And Charles started training him before. There's a connection. Judd trained under Charles in the late 90s before Charles was famous. That's how I became aware of Charles.
Okay.
And Judd would pull out these journals of Charles's workouts that he sent him in the mail, right? And Judd would be doing them, and there would be all the information. And Judd was a brilliant strength coach as well as world-class athlete. And he had an amazing ability to translate Charles. He was another one of these proteges to a mentorship. And then I obviously trained under Judd and Charles, so like, here's an example of Charles getting crapped on by the industry, but I can give you a perfect example of how the methodology matters. So Judd couldn't get his power clean over 400 pounds, which we're already talking monster numbers, right? We're like, This is ridiculous. And so he couldn't get his power clean from the floor over 400 pounds. So Charles did a bunch of testing, like systematically of Judd, not just big movements, sit back on a box stuff, right? But he's like, well, let's test you and see the relationships, which became the principles for Poliquin strength and conditioning education system. And he realized that like Judd had this massive deficiency in like brachioradialis strength, or like the power, flexor of the arm. Like he just had a massive deficiency there compared to the other strengths of his upper body. So he convinced Judd, and this is such a funny story because people don't know this, but he convinced Judd in the off season as a hammer thrower, right, which shouldn't train arms at all, as they claim, as a hammer thrower, Olympian, world-class, multi-Olympics already, hey, you should do a bunch of forearm elbow flexion work. It made no sense, like 0 sense. If I was to even talk about that now at like USATF level 3, people probably still laugh about it. But what they don't realize is a muscle's ability to fully lengthen and relax is equal to its ability in strength, right? So like people that get these shortened like flinch responses to training or to movement, and they just don't function properly. It's because they're too weak to relax. They're too weak to be long and strong, right? So Judd plays a sports where his arms, like mine, where hammer throwers have to be fully extended, elbow locked out to 90. Well, he had an issue there as well. So you take all that information, and what ends up happening? Judd just buys in, right? Because Judd, he was a seeker of information at that point in his life. That's what made him literally the most successful throws coach in America. So he goes out, does all this forearm work along with all the other stuff, and gets strong everywhere, but does all this forearm flexion work and bicep work. Well, holy shit, power cleans 440, right? Has a monster breakthrough as an Olympic athlete. Wow. At the time, I think his power clean was on par with the best Olympic clean from the U.S. team, which, let's be honest, that means our Olympic team was a little suspect. But for a hammer thrower, 440 was really good. Like that's strong. Starts dropping bombs in the hammer because he's also able to stay in this lengthened position through the moment of release, where he doesn't have a flinch shortening like thing happen at the elbow, because as that explosive release and that tension is about to go, it's when the hammer's its heaviest. As a guy throwing 81 meters, the hammer weighed roughly 900 pounds at the moment of release for that split second, as it's accelerating through 0. So there's a guy who was shortening his elbows by bending them in the hammer to prevent a muscle tear because of the weight of the hammer. Well, shit, he fixed that by doing some bodybuilding work. And that's where the genius, and this is where a 7-hour podcast happens, but that's where the genius gets big, right? Where you're like, oh, okay, that's why knees over toes is still relevant. That's why meat and nut breakfast and its ability to create neurotransmission in the brain at awakening is still valuable. It's why we're still looking at the negative impact of sugar and carbohydrates on inflammation is still a current conversation, because Charles was able to take all that information and all the supplementation guidelines and all the training principles and clear it up and put it into a context where there was if I take this piece, it'll fit into this whole mentality. And I think that's what we lost with Charles. And to some degree, I think that's what we lost even with Judd in the coaching world recently, actually to a big degree. And we'll see. It's, Judd just left us. So was someone underneath him still putting the stuff together that will be able to continue that lineage? Or now is it up to a few dozen of us that have to do it as a collective because it was such a huge amount of information to harness? I don't know. But I think, 20 years from now, you're going to see some successful coach and you'll be like, where's your lineage mentorship? Charles Poliquin 40 years ago, Judd Logan 20 years ago, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that will continue. I don't believe there's an influencer in the world that can replicate what that is. And if they're smart, they will have studied the crap out of it and integrated it into what they are. Yeah.
And that kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier. It's okay to have ego, but set it aside to be able to try and learn new things.
It's essential, right? Like your ego should get you up at 6 a.m. to win, right? That the ego, the super ego, the dopamine driven, right? The reward center in your brain that makes you want to be a high achiever. That gets you up at 6 a.m. But after that, you have to come to realizations very quickly that mentorship, success, teachers, guides, leaders, that's the only way that you will absolutely maximize human performance, psychological performance, business performance. I remember meeting a guy one time, and he was a very successful business person. And we were just chatting, and he goes, the best thing I ever did was hire the degrees I couldn't get. And that's how he looked at business. He goes, I'm not good at and he just listed these things. He goes, but man, it sure was awesome to be able to hire these MBAs, these, masters of this, these doctorates of that. He goes, that's my business. He goes, I knew what I needed. I knew how to manage their personalities. He goes, but I don't know how to do any of the things that we sell. He goes, that's not me. He goes, but I just knew if I could get the right people together that it would sell, right, et cetera, right?
And that's kind of the formula, I think, for success in anything.
Right.
It's being able to put all those people that excel in one area in the right place. 'Cause I do have one more question, completely unrelated to what we were talking about, but I'm always interested when I hear you speak about your perspective on different things. And I don't know if that came from all your travels, like being in the Middle East for so many years. But first, since you're originally from Canada, I want to get your take. What's your take on what has been going on up there the last couple of weeks?
Right. Yeah, because my parents are still Canadian. They're still across the border, right? Yeah. Was there another part to that question, or do you want me to start with that?
Well, I was going to start with that, and then even bigger picture, do you feel like we are more and more people are waking up kind of what's going on?
So I'm kind of torn on that, right? So with the Canadian situation, it's very easy to be on social media because social media's algorithms make it seem like everybody has your belief system, right? That's how it's created. So, you get someone on social media is making a meme about the police smashing out a window on a trucker's truck out in Ottawa, pulling them out, all this stuff. I get that, right? And you're going to see that meme, and you're going to see that whole avenue of thought, and you're going to be like, holy crap, everybody's on the same page as me. This is unacceptable. No, that's the problem, in my opinion. What you're seeing is like-minded people having a conversation in an echo chamber, right? It's an illusion because the person that posted it is from, Medicine Hat, right? And you're from BC, or you're from out in Timmins, Ontario, so you're like, oh, everybody's the same. No, they've taken like-minded people and stuck them together. Here's the problem. It's only been 6 months since that guy got reelected as the Prime Minister of Canada, right? You don't get reelected because people disagree with you as a collective whole. Now, people come back with the argument that, but he lost power because the secondary and third parties in Canada split up a lot of votes. Okay, so let's have another conversation then. If there's that many people that disagree with what's happening and are that anti-Trudeau that they went and just voted for, like we see it down here in the US, like in California, there was like 100,000 people in the area that I was living that voted Libertarian, right? People forget that there are people like that in the state of California no, that can't be. No, of course it is, right? But so when you look at that, these people are so fed up with the system, they go and vote for this isolated little pocket that will have no impact on what changes in that country, right? And I just want to grab these people and be like, listen, you need to get on the same page here. The reason why the system isn't working is because the divisiveness of social media is working perfectly. your little group of separatist mindset people in southeastern BC that are like, F Trudeau, F the system, we got to bring this whole thing back to baseline and get people back to center, you're only speaking to yourselves. And you think the whole world is like you because you go on social media and you see 400 posts today about this one potential candidate of an independent party that you're going to go vote for because you think there's 1,000 other people in your neighborhood alone that must think this way. So you run out to the polls, vote for this rando prime minister candidate that shifts the vote 0.001% because you realize no one really voted for him. But now your conservative vote didn't go towards the conservative party, and they don't have enough when the dust settles to overthrow the prime minister. And now we get all the way into the future, right, which is today, of people so broken and exhausted from the mandated system in Canada and the over-governing of the country that we have the Freedom Convoy end up in Ottawa that pulls an executive order equivalent or basically martial law out, right? To the point where 6 months ago, if you guys had have just like taken the blinders off that social media had put on you and realized that you had to find one collective voice on your side to overthrow this collective voice on that side, that you could have actually shifted the election and we would have had a new prime minister. Would have it been better? Who knows, right? But you would have had someone different, most definitely different. And typically different brings a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction because they want to be different. So they probably would have got rid of mandates and done all this and got people back to work. But because of that, because of social, and I use social media, I'm not saying that social media is the devil, but if you lose self-awareness or global awareness outside of it, you will believe that everyone that thinks the way you do makes up a much larger majority of the cultural society than they actually do. Like, you could be really into something hyper specific, and on social media there will be a world for that you will find, and it'll seem like it's a massive world of similar beliefs, but it's not. You're still the only person in southern British Columbia that is a cricket collector, right? Or a stamp collector of a specific stamp. And so I think that's what's happened in Canada is I don't think, like, we can make the argument now that there is this massive silent minority, right, that traveled all the way out to Ottawa and had this protest and did this thing that everybody saw. Okay, well, here's where it gets interesting. Where my parents live in southern BC, that whole area is conservative. Whole area. It's all loggers, miners, hunting, fishing, right? We get a bad rap over the years because they'll make fun of us because we're so different than Vancouver, which would be like comparing Texas to Los Angeles, or not. Texas has even changed a little bit, but it would be like comparing Montana to Los Angeles, right? Where we lived in southern BC, it's conservative. Now, it's changed a little because people that are predominantly liberal belief systems that are looking for an outdoors lifestyle have moved there. So it's changed, but it voted conservative. It voted conservative across the board. No one from that area went to Ottawa, right? None of them got in a truck. None of them headed east. They didn't. Why? Because they're just making the best of their life where they're at, right? So even though that representation of the country was massive in terms of, holy crap, look at all those trucks in Ottawa, it's still small, right? The country's got 40 million people. 22 million didn't show up in Ottawa, right? Or whatever they're saying the potential shifting vote would be. So when I look at that, it's like, okay, we need leadership in the country that is more middle. And then there's some good candidates in Canada that now are throwing their hat back into it that are hopefully going to have the ability to flip the vote. Granted, I don't know how, I think we got 3.5 more years of this guy, right? Because he just re-won the election, which he threw for himself because of the Canadian system during the pandemic. And these people still voted him in. They either voted him in through their inaction or voted him in through poor decision-making, right? Now, with that being said, I do think that it'll be hard for him to win another election. Granted, the conspiracy theorist in me said he doesn't want to win another election anyway, because he'll probably be one of these guys that gets out of politics and then magically ends up in some, think tank of, it's going to make me sound like a tinfoil hat wearer, but some think tank that's funded by the Gates Foundation or the UN or some sort of giant environmental push. And it'll be like, man, Trudeau just went from making 400 a year. Now he's worth 120 million working for this massive think tank that's backed by big pharma, right? Like it almost seems like it's writing itself. Now that's the conspiracy theorist in me, but it does seem to be the case. Now, with that being said, what's happening now in Ottawa and with the way that they're cracking down on people and freezing bank accounts, do I think it's happening? Yeah, I think so. Again, it's happening a lot if that's the only media that you're watching. But I think we have to kind of pull back to the bigger picture and be like, okay, so this is where it gets crazy, because I have friends that are liberals in BC that are just like, you're not going to believe what's happening up here. So you take Florida or where I live in Montana or wherever. We understand the pandemic has existed. We understand that people with certain health issues have passed away. We don't deny any of that. But we've pushed to get back to a state of existence in spite of the pandemic, right? In spite of the deaths, in spite of the setbacks. We're pushing forward to get back to a life that we remembered. People in British Columbia that don't have access to, say, real news. And I'm not even just saying Fox or Newsmax that push out that hard right agenda, or even some of the Fox News is actually pretty in the center, depending on who you listen to. But not even those people. I'm talking about even guys like Joe Rogan that are clearly centralist, slightly left-leaning. When you look at those people, the people in BC, they don't actually believe that Florida is a year and a half out of this thing. They don't believe it, depending where they live in BC. They think like Florida, as they describe to me, is still, and Governor DeSantis are still a punchline to a lot of jokes in Vancouver. And you're like, you realize that if you just got on a train or a plane and went 6 hours south, you would end up in areas where people haven't been masked for months. And yeah, there's still COVID. I got COVID on my birthday in October. And people will be like, yeah, but you're just one of these guys. I got vaccinated so long ago, I can't remember getting vaccinated. I got vaccinated living in California, right? So I can have that conversation. My fiance got vaccinated. My fiance, we almost had to take her to the emergency room when she got the vaccine. So I went through all that stuff too, right? And then, so I got vaccinated, my second one from a Pfizer, and sure as shit, 7 months later, I got COVID, right? So if you want to have the vaccine conversation, I'll have that one too, because I didn't deny it. I didn't fear it. I was like, well, yeah, I grew up in Canada. I got a little blue card with vaccines out the ass. I grew up in a vaccine culture. So I didn't have any of those gut reaction fears to any of this. But I hated masks because it's bullshit, right? I hated the way they locked down everything because it didn't make sense. And I just looked at it as a realist. But the problem is when you look at how, in my opinion, this is a huge rant going off of Ottawa, but when you look at how this is all happening, you can't deny the fact that it has nothing to do with medical safety at this point. The things they're doing in Ottawa to these truckers, it's control. We're not talking super spreader event. That's not being spoke about on the media at all. Shouldn't have that been their gut reaction to all these truckers coming to Ottawa? Oh my God, it's going to be a super spreader event and they're going to overwhelm the hospitals. I haven't heard that said once. This is about domestic terrorism, right? And all this other bullshit that they're trying to push down people's throats now. Why? Because no one's getting sick from the super spreader event in Ottawa. And they can't sell that in the media. Like, people just need to ask the big questions, right?
And it's a tough sell after they just had 70,000 in SoFi for the Super Bowl.
For the Super Bowl, and no one was masked.
No one was masked. Even Newsom, the LA mayor, none of those guys were masked. And God forbid we say super spreader about that event.
100%. Like when I was living in California, even though I was in the Eastern Sierras, we lived in one of the most locked down towns in California because we had those type, it sounds so shitty to say, we had those types of people that lived there, right? And they just, so I haven't lived there in over a year. They just removed the indoor mask mandate last week. That town is one of the most vaccinated towns in America per capita. And it was one of the first vaccinated towns in the city or state of California. So why were they still wearing masks until this past week? And why did they drop the masks indoor this last week? Oh, yeah, because of the Super Bowl. And everybody was going to have egg on their face if they kept pushing masks, right? But, you know, you look at that and you just look at how all of it's been twisted into bullshit. Like, for example, in Mammoth Lakes, a year ago, we were under purple, which means limited hours, people shut down, couldn't be inside, fully masked up. But you could have 20,000 visitors on the ski hill all using the same bathroom with no like controls, right? So you'd have 20,000 people on the mountain skiing, and people, you go into a bathroom and it's just wall to wall, right? The restaurant around the corner, they're spacing people out. Where people are, you know, going to the washroom, dirty, coughing, sneezing, who gives a shit, right? And you can't deny the fact that just, you know, so A, they got to stay open while the rest of the state was closed. They could have 20,000 visitors on a Saturday. And, oh, that's right, they made very generous multi-million-dollar donations the year, you know, in the year previous, months previous, to a lot of organizations that were in the news that year. That's amazing how you can buy, you know, it's amazing to me that you can buy the ability not to be a super spreader event. That also amazed me, right? Like, and it happened over and over and over.
There's so many stories, but even like when I first started flying through the pandemic, we had to stand in line to board the plane 6 feet apart. And then we're going to go sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers for the next 3 hours. And then when we had to get off the plane, please space back out. I'm like, no, I'm pretty sure if this person had COVID, I got it.
You got it. And you know what's so funny about it is the two things that really caught me off guard during that whole deal. Because I used to travel for a living. I would be into the Middle East every 30 days for 7 years, right? Or somewhere in the world. You know, at Poliquin, it was 200 days on the road a year. So I got so good at airports that it became my second home, you know? And then I had this huge break during the pandemic where I didn't travel. I didn't get on a plane forever. And in fact, my travel was a winter strong to a summer strong. So it had been 15 months that I hadn't been on an airplane. And so I didn't know what to expect, right? Flew out of Reno at the time, hit LAX, and then I had to hit Atlanta. And I was like, oh my God, I've never seen airports this busy in my life. And that was the thing that the media was not talking about. Even I had no clue, just based off of, whatever media I was getting, social media, whatnot, is they made it seem like no one was traveling, no one was leaving their home. And for people up in Canada that weren't allowed to leave, like my parents who weren't, I'll tell that story in a second, that'll blow your mind, but weren't traveling at all, to be in that airport was like oh, this is all bullshit, right? This is a giant lie, because if I'm in, if I've flown for a living, I'm in the Atlanta airport and this is literally the busiest I've ever seen it in my entire life of traveling through it, that means it's the busiest it's ever been in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
Period. Full stop. There's no, they didn't shrink the airport, right? So if it is now wall to wall, say going through DIA in Denver, and it's never been wall to wall when I lived in Denver, there's more people, right? And then it just gets into this twisted stuff. So my parents, by the way, like, get in my car right now and I drive north, I am at my parents' door in 170 miles, right? So that's where I live in Montana, to where I grew up. So remember when Biden wouldn't open up the southern border, or the border traveling south into the US from Canada, but you could still fly? So give people a perspective of how ludicrous that this entire thing has been. My parents, who live, 3 hours from Calgary, Alberta, right? Or 3 hours from me down here in Montana, they could get in their car, Canadians in their, 70s, fully vaccinated, the whole nine, right? They did everything that they thought they needed to do to be able to come and see us. So they could get in their car, drive 3 hours east to the Calgary airport, sit in a crowded airport for 1 to 3 hours, fly, because there's not a direct flight, fly to Denver in that, in the viral tube of an airplane, right? Sit in DIA 2 to 3 hours, all those people, get in another pandemic tube, fly to Montana, right? And then would pick them up, so 8 to 10 hours later, surrounded by tens of thousands of people. That was allowed, totally acceptable, right? Could do it as long as you're good to go. What could they not do? Be self-isolated in their car for a 3-hour drive to the border where they would be more than 6 feet from a crossing guard who takes their papers, looks at it, give them back, continue to drive completely self-isolated to our house and never leave it. They were not allowed to do that for 2 years, but they could get in an airplane and super spread the shit out of it, right?
Yeah.
And so, when you just stop and look at even the micro level things, you're like, so I don't believe this is a giant cabal for New World Order. I don't believe any of that. What I do believe is we have a lot of people that get paid a lot of money and have a lot of responsibility to do a job really poorly. And I think we got a lot of people doing a job they probably aren't qualified to do. And I think that's the issue we have right now in North America. I think a lot of our the term leader doesn't fully apply to what they're doing. They don't know how to do the job.
And coming full circle, even back to the Charles conversation, there's no talk about, taking care of yourself. Vitamin D, which is super cheap.
Yep.
Zinc, which is pretty inexpensive. Eating healthy, getting some exercise. There's very little talk. We see it with, you probably way more than me in the circles you run in, but in the grand scheme of things, it's never talked about or brought up.
Yep. Never talked about. Queen Elizabeth has COVID right now.
At 95, right? Is that right?
I think she's 99.
Oh, okay.
I could be wrong. She might be 95. I know she's old.
Well, I saw she's still working, taking care of some light duties. I don't know what that involves, but.
Right. So there's so much of it that people just aren't willing to accept yet. But then again, it gets right back into the problem of virtual signaling. And it gets back into the fact that the same people, here's something that I think people need to really come to terms with. Humans don't like as many people or to be recognized by as many people as a collective whole as people think, right? So what that means to me is the percentage of people that are outgoing, interactive members of society that like to have conversations with people, like to get things done, like to work with teams and groups to build a better world, there's way less of those people than we realized, way less. And in fact, what appears to be the case is the vast majority of people don't want to leave their house, don't want people to see their face, want to somewhat hide and shun from the responsibilities of being a part of a society that was their birthright, but don't want to be a part of, right? And I think that that's a real issue. And, I was having a conversation with someone recently because they sent me a clip in relationship to a lot. So very short segue, so you know where I'm going with this. I recently went back to school to become a sheriff's reserve officer. So a lot of the stuff we're talking about in class right now is to do with child trafficking, child pornography. Where does the metaverse go from here? What does that do in terms of putting children at prey from predators? These are real conversations that people aren't really ready to have yet. In the metaverse, if you have a 12-year-old boy that is digitally created himself to be X and we have a 45-year-old predator in there who's digitally created himself to be a 15-year-old girl. What is that? Is that child pornography? Where are we going with all of this, right? And so back to my point is, there's a massively increasing number of people that want to live in that world where nothing really exists. Like wearing a mask, hands covered, hat pulled down, AirPods in, walking down a street. You're not that far from turning yourself into an avatar at that point in real life, right? Like you don't exist. Having lived in the Middle East, I've talked about this and taken some heat on Power Athlete. The abaya, the burqas, all of that. That is what that's for, right? To conceal the feminine figure. And they say because, they can't control their urges towards men. Nice try. It's it's because it's more than likely that you're not going to be sexually attracted to a walking sleeping bag with eyes cut out of it, right? So when you look at that and you look at what's happening there, it's the dehumanizing of a person to create a real-time invisibility cloak, right? Now, what you don't realize is that's what people are already doing with all these mask mandates and isolation and separating themselves. Now you take that, you keep going down that road, and you get them into the metaverse, and you get them into these existences in which they don't have any tactile connection to the world around them. They can just vanish into the fantasy of whatever that is that they create. Now, what I do believe will happen to that is it's going to create, and I think it's kind of what we're dealing with right now, is this rift separation, this breaking from those that want to be tactile, in contact with, communicative, tribe-forming people, and those that want to be separate. And it's weird to think that we could be 20 years down the road from this, and there'll be like these weird, like sci-fi, Isaac Asimov, like separations of people, where you'll have those that are like, the cyber technical metaverse existing culture, and then you'll have like the earthbound, doers out in society culture. And it makes you wonder if they will even interact, right? I know they would all want us in the metaverse. I just don't think it's going to happen.
No, and it's interesting. You talked earlier about growing up. You knew everybody's voice, not just their name, but you knew everybody's voice on the phone. There's a lot of neighborhoods in our country now where people don't know their next door neighbor.
No.
They could see them walk right by and they'd be like, I don't know who that is.
And I think that's a major problem. Like, I came through sports, right? So, and I came from Canada, and the town I grew up in was an immigrant-based town, right? So we had the oldest Sikh temple in North America was in my town. So 40 to 50% of the kids I grew up with were Eastern Indian descent or Pakistani, as well as Indigenous Canadian, or what we think of as Native Canadian. Half of my family is Native Canadian. A lot of my uncles and aunts married into the Native community, the Indigenous community of Canada. So for me, I grew up, and that was normal, right? So when I got to the US and started playing sports with African-American and Black athletes, depending if they came from the islands, like Bahamas, Trinidad, or if they were American-born African-American kids, for me, it was just another day playing sports with people that, as I've said in the past, wanted to hang around with, didn't get along with, or might have had a crush or was secretly in love with, right? So that's how I've always been, especially when it came to athletics and race and all that stuff. Now, there's been a lot of studies that have been done where they're trying to get people to realize this. And this is why I believe sports are so important. Like, we can talk about all this stuff, and I can go down the tinfoil hat stuff that I just did. But when I get back to the nuts and bolts of my belief system, the reason I believe sports and kids are so important is we know that regardless of race, creed, sexuality, etc., regardless of all those things, the one thing that they have found with humans in particular that makes them bond deeper and eradicate all the fluff quicker is a unified goal, a unified desire, or things in which they all do collectively that are the same, if that makes sense. So they did a study where they took people and, that were kind of all from the same background in terms they all worked in a mine or they all worked for a logging company. And regardless of what their race was or what their religious beliefs were, they all identified as miners. They all identified as loggers. And other people, regardless of race, were other people, right? We are from this town. Let's use that as an example. Our town, let's call it the town of Dave. Regardless of your race or background, if you're all from town Dave, you will all connect as that. That's who you are. Now, will you have differences on a personal level? Like, Bob's an asshole, but we work together. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
But what they realized is when you can create those bonds of a unified goal or a unified system in which you're all working together to do things, that's what you identify as first and foremost, regardless of everything else. So like the Denver Broncos are the Broncos. They'll have interfighting. Like when I worked for the Browns, our guys would get it on a Tuesday morning, but it was always over the same crap. It was always over someone talking crap about the position they played with the other guy. And it was just like a competitive testosterone deal. It was never because of who they were or where they were from. Right? It was just like their elbows were rubbing too much, standing in line. And it was, the guys used to say, if you can't get along, get it on. Right? So it's sports, right? But I'll tell you what, you wouldn't want to be the other team coming into that field house at that moment and talking shit about that happening, because those two brothers, right, from different mothers would turn on that team and that's where they would go. And the unification and all the other stuff would be wayside stuff. Right? They'd be like, oh, we're unified again. This is my brother. You stepped into our house. You're in trouble. And that's why if you can get your kids into sports young, and a lot of sports, not just, not hockey mom, I'm at like 3 and be like, we're going to the NHL, right? But like get them in young, get them into a lot of things where they have to socialize with people from all sorts of backgrounds, race, religion, color, all that stuff. You get them in. You get them friendships and bonding and connections. It would solve so many problems. But you got to get out of the metaverse to do that, right?
And that metaverse, and that's so good because that metaverse, back to you were talking earlier, isolation.
Yes.
You can become isolated in your own metaverse and see what, like you said, see exactly what you want to see.
Right.
And nothing else. And our belief systems aren't challenged.
Yep.
Well, and it's a dangerous place.
Once a week, I go through my story on Instagram, the one they curate for you. And I go through everything I've looked at for like pages. And I hit not interested all the way down, even if I'm interested, because I just want it to reset. And I want that algorithm to stop trying to pigeonhole me into what I've, because I might have been looking at hunting and camping gear because I was looking for something for a few days. That doesn't mean the only thing I want to look at is hunting and camping gear, right? Yeah. Or the only thing I want to look at is fit and figure. It's like, yes, there's a lot of beautiful women that work out, but I don't need 75 photos of the same thing. I know they exist, exactly, right? I want to just be free of that, whatever that has become.
Well, I think that's a good way to close. Man, I've enjoyed this so much. I appreciate your time. Where's the best place speaking of Instagram, where's the best place that people can probably find you?
I keep it simple. Instagram's just my name, Derek Woodske. The only thing I ask, and it's finally gotten to the point, is, 5, 6, 7 years up to this point, I used to write a lot when I was in the Middle East and I was like traveling and doing that stuff. I wrote a lot of stuff, like I called them microblogs back then. So if someone goes to my Instagram, scroll back, I won't think it's weird if you like a photo from 4 years ago, just because I wrote something that was relevant, so don't be afraid to read the old stuff. And that's the biggest part. Everything that I do, I use I have Facebook. I don't use it. I haven't used it for years. Instagram is my only form of social media that I use.
Well, awesome. I've enjoyed this. Thank you again. And as always, thank you for listening.